Hi, I'm Mark Brumley with Ignatius Press, and we're here today with Carl Olson, the editor of Catholic World Report, and we're doing a report on Catholic World Report. Hi, Carl.
Thankfully, not an investigative report.
Investigative reporters are outside your door right now.
The albino monks are at the door, as I like to joke. After all these years with the Da Vinci hoax and Da Vinci Code stuff, yeah. If I hear a knock on the door while we're talking, I know what's going on.
Regular listeners know from time to time we touch base with you to find out what's going on with Catholic World Report. And of course, new listeners will not know anything about it. They will not know anything about you. They will not have caught your reference to the Da Vinci hoax. But that's okay. We welcome newcomers as well. Carl, let's talk a little bit about what's been going on in the church. We always have to be somewhat careful about not dating ourselves because people might listen to this or watch this, a year from now or whenever. So we don't want it to be too much caught up in what happened last week. By the way, what happened last week, I'm not sure. But anyway, but we are going to talk about Catholic World Report, and Catholic World Report is a news magazine. So what are some of the latest things you think we should bring to people's attention?
Well, as you know, Mark, traditionally this time of the year, in terms of just if we're going to talk about focus in like on the Vatican and things that are going on with the Pope, of course, it's usually a little bit quieter, but we have the trip. Usually. We did have the recent trip of Pope Francis to Canada, which of course generated a lot of interest, and there was a lot of focus, of course, on his comments regarding the schools there, the different things that may or may not have happened with Indigenous people that were students in these schools, and then of course, as usual, and this is just descriptive. I mean, neither positive or negative. On the way back on the airplane, Pope Francis made further remarks, and it has become kind of a regular thing that when he makes comments returning from trips, yes, he will inevitably say two or three things that create some buzz and generate some furor or whatever it would be. In this case, he made remarks about genocide, and he also talked about possibility of retirement. On the latter, the thing about the retirement was interesting because he actually didn't bring it up. He was asked this question three times, two different reporters. One asked two questions about it, another asked a question, follow-up question. There seems to be a real interest. There is a real interest, and there has been for a while because of his now fairly well-documented health problems. A lot of speculation about whether he will continue or if he at some point does have a plan to possibly retire. And I think the way to sum up what he says, and I thought what he said about the possibility of retirement was very even-keeled, and I thought it was actually very interesting because he said that it's a possibility. He left the door open, but he in no way said yes, it's going to happen, or implied strongly that it's going to happen. He did not do that. He just said that's a possibility, and I think that's totally fine and even wise for him to say. It's out there. Benedict, of course, retired, and I think one of the things that people are wondering about if say Pope Francis decides to retire in August, and there's been speculation he might do something like that. I personally don't think he's going to, but then we'd
we've got half a month to find out.
We have some time to find out. We'd be in this really, really strange situation with two retired popes, popes emeritus, however you want to put it, etc. But I think there's a little bit too much made out of this, and I think that to me, to put it kind of simplistically, because there's obviously a lot involved in it, that to remember that the papacy is an office, the Petrine office, and that even if we had two former popes and a new pope, that no, we don't have three popes, etc. So I bring this up because I did an interview about it last week with Drew Mariani on Relevant Radio, and I know it's something that's going to probably continue to be of interest as we approach the upcoming meeting, in Rome later this month with some cardinals. So I think that's been, the Canadian trip and some of the things that came out of the interview, that's been We've had a number of pieces on Catholic World Report about that. And certainly that was worth focusing on during that time and going forward.
On the retirement business, I mean, I've seen this run lots of different directions, as I'm sure you have. On the one hand, you read a story where we'll sort of downplay, oh, the Pope, yeah, well, it's just kind of an abstract theoretical conversation. And then you'll see another article or a headline that will say, the Pope's just about ready to retire. He's going to step
Right.
down, that kind of thing. And of course, as you say, what he actually says is, in one sense, not that controversial. Now, in another sense, it is, because until Benedict retired, popes didn't retire. It had been 500 years or 600 years, whatever it had been, since the previous pope retired. So it was not something that was part of ordinary discourse about the pope, certainly not from the pope. And so, yeah, it was a big deal that Benedict retired. So now there's an expectation. Well, if Benedict retired, maybe this is going to become a more typical thing. And then, of course, you get into the church politics issue. There are people who want to see Francis retire because they don't like his papacy. And then there are other people who want to see Francis retire. And they may even be sort of ideologically sympathetic to his papacy, but they like the idea of popes retiring. They like the idea of sort of regularizing the papacy. You mentioned it as an office. Some people think of it more in terms of a job. And when somebody reaches a certain age, that person retires. There's no big deal about that. So there's that kind of thing. And of course, then there's the media. Anything that's unusual or different, they want to see happen because it gives them something to report on and talk about. So there's a lot of dynamics involved with this papal conversation. You mentioned something about the Pope's health, and there is a lot of speculation about that. I don't know about you, but I see a similar kind of conflicting messaging. There'll be some talk about the Pope didn't go here because he's had this illness or this condition. And then as soon as the talk reaches a certain level and people start drawing inferences about the Pope's resignation or possible passing away or something, then there's this issue, the tendency of the Vatican to try to downplay it. And that's natural enough. So have you been seeing that too with respect to the Pope's health?
Well, what I saw when you go back and read the interview on the plane returning to Rome from Canada, it was interesting how, I don't have it in front of me, but the question was basically, I think I'm being very fair to the question here. It was couched in terms of, if you're no longer able to travel as much as Pope, do you think you'll continue your papacy? Now, I understand the question, but I think it's kind of interesting, the implication behind it. Well, if you can't travel, then why would you continue as Pope? As though the
Right.
Pope, the papacy is about traveling.
Right.
Obviously, up until especially with John Paul II, you didn't have popes traveling a great deal.
Right. Really,
in fact,
Paul VI was the one
was the
that
first.
became the sort of international pope in that sense.
And so like when I was talking about this last week with Drew Mariani, the point I made is, whatever happens, whether Pope Francis retires, whether he doesn't, I think it really behooves us as Catholic to really try to be as clear as we can in our conversations and the way that we even think about the church on what the papacy really is and isn't. What is the purpose of the papacy? Papal trips, are fine. In fact, they can be very great things. You think about some of the historic ones that have taken place, John Paul II going to Poland, etc. But I think right now it behooves us to really hone in on a clear idea of what the papacy is and is not. This idea that the Pope is, in some people's minds, just kind of going along with that idea that's a job. It's like, well, he makes his policy, he implements his policy, he has these things that he's going to push through. Of course, part of this confusion, I think, for Americans comes from the fact that most people don't seem to have a clear idea about the three branches of government in the United States, and they kind of view the presidency as an office where you can make stuff up, and you have all these executive orders, and that's the way that you do things. And some folks, I think, see the papacy in those same terms, which is unfortunate because that's a very politicized an incorrect view of, the papacy inherently is one of conserving, defending, and if necessary, defining. And so I think
there's a lot there. We could have a whole conversation.
There's a lot. Yeah, there is. Exactly.
On the one hand, I'm like you. I resist the temptation to understand the papal ministry. We're going to underscore the word ministry, the Petrine office, Petrine ministry of the Pope, in political terms, which usually that's understood to refer to power and how power is exercised and so on. But on the other hand, there is politics in the sense that you have people with different views of things in the life and mission of the church, how the church should be arranged, who should be appointed bishops, how bishops should minister in their own dioceses, and in a certain sense, that's political. And I have to say that I'm not trying to get into an analysis of the current pontificate, but to some degree, things like the synodal process, not synodality necessarily. The idea of synodality, that we're all in this together, as it were. We're all part of the pilgrim church, and we're on this pilgrimage to the kingdom of God, the fullness of the kingdom of God, beyond history, at the end of history, and so on. That's a when the Holy Father talks about it being sort of a fundamental element of the life of the church, that is, of course, true. We don't always use that word, synodality, but it is, of course, true. Synodal process refers to a human construct. How do we do this thing together? And so when you have different groups, including groups not just on the periphery of the church's life, but at odds with the church in some way, and they're part of the consultative process, part of the conversation, naturally enough, you're going to see a kind of a power dynamic. People in charge, people in leadership having a certain view of the life and mission of the church and the teaching of the church. People, some of the people at large who aren't so exercising leadership, agreeing with that and saying, let's get on with it. And here are my ideas how to be more effective. But other people saying, no, fundamentally, the church is mistaken about this, mistaken about that. Or the church may be right in her teaching, but she's fundamentally wrong in how she's implemented that teaching and what she's done, so on. There is a dynamic that comes into play that's political. So you can understand people looking at the papacy and saying, well, if all these things are going on and there is this direction of the church and how the church articulates her mission and how that teaching is presented, you can begin to see why a secular reporter or even a church reporter would say, well, I want to know if Francis is going to retire, because what does that mean for a change or different, or even if the reporter is not necessarily ideologically driven, but simply wants something different to report on, you can begin to understand why they would look at it that way. I know I said a lot there, but
well, I think if we spend as much time focusing on what we actually should be doing as Catholics as we do on anticipating change, we'd be a little bit better off, speaking in really general terms. Yeah, when I say political, I would emphasize that I'm kind of talking about the the left, right, conservative, liberal paradigm. Absolutely, I mean, it's absolutely true. Where two or three are gathered, there are political factions.
There's politics in my two or three gathered in my name. There is politics
because as we know, politics just in general reflect the social reality of what it means to be a human. The problem is that I think many people, to be more specific, many people view the papacy in terms of left, right, conservative, liberal. And of course, those terms are kind of fluid as well. But rather than a Catholic approach, which really looks at things in terms of continuity, orthodoxy, those realities. So it's just and then we have, like you mentioned, synodality, and we have always, since the beginning of this particular pontificate, we've had so many interesting adventures with synodality. In fact, wouldn't that be a great book title, Adventures in Synodality?
Synodality, right.
It could be an ongoing series.
It might be both comedic and horrifying.
It could be like Stranger Things, a combination of, comedy, thriller, horror.
I say that, but I as somebody was in charge, kind of, not really in charge, but I've worked with the bishop here in the Diocese of Santa Rosa for the synodal process, and ours was modest because we're a fairly small rural diocese, and and I've been involved with synodal processes in various places in the church. I don't want to be too negative because I think it's fundamentally an appropriate process. If you're serious about your Catholic faith and you're prayerful and discerning, I think it can be important. If you're not, then those who are serious about their Catholic faith commitment and prayerful and discerning need to be prayerful and discerning about what input you give in the consultative synodal process. Anyway.
Yeah, I think how I would summarize how I view it is, it seems to me, to put it in kind of simple terms, that you have folks who constantly look at the church in terms of what can we change, what can we change, what can we change, and then you have those who look at it like, well, how can I change? How can I when I go deeper into the Catholic faith, when I have a deeper encounter with Jesus Christ, when I participate more fully at Mass, etc., how does it change me? How can I better conform myself to Christ? And I think this is you go back to the very beginning of the church. This has been the one of the dividing lines is, are we trying to conform the church and the faith in our image, or are we trying to be conformed by the faith itself, which of course ultimately means being conformed by the work of the power of the Holy Spirit, etc. So we see the same dynamic at play today. And of course, it's complex because it's not like it's just the good guys and the bad guys, or dark and light, or whatever. There's a lot of different
salt and
layers.
pepper.
Yeah, there's a lot of different aspects to it. I was going to mention that in terms of synodality, there was a poll, and you probably know a little bit more about this than I do. Jimmy Akin had put something out there on Twitter about this poll that the Vatican had put out. And one of the questions, and I really just saw this briefly because I was traveling this past week, visiting family in Montana. But it was about, how do you as a young person view the church? And it had some pretty interesting, adjectives, authoritative, et cetera, whatever, some positive, some kind of negative. But I mentioned that because, there's a lot of hubbub and debate about that. But at Catholic World Report, we just posted a piece, the first in a series of pieces by Ben Erickson on Generation Z, the millennials. And I think it's going to be a very interesting and very informative series. And I should note that it came about because you put me in touch with Ben, who's himself, younger. I think he's 28, if I remember correctly, doctoral student at Catholic University of America.
Right.
But this piece that he wrote for us, and it's going to be part of I think we talked about 6 or 7 pieces, where he dives deep into a lot of recent data about Generation Z and how they view the faith, how they view reality.
Okay. I'm going to stop you because not everybody is up on the lingo. So what do you mean by Generation Z? What is Generation Z? Some people are still wondering what Generation X is, and you're talking about Generation Z now.
Right. He's talking about those in Generation Z, and he does the very first paragraph. Actually, he explains that those who were born between 1997 and 2012 are part of Generation Z. So that'd be those who are basically 10 years old to 25 years old are part of Generation Z. So yeah, that's a great criteria because there's obviously all the, Gen X and the greatest generation, all this. So we're talking about people who are ages 10 to 25, preteen, young adult, or teenagers, young adult. And there's been a lot of interesting studies done. He particularly picks up on one, the most in-depth study that's been done recently, and the first piece that we have up there is kind of an introduction, but he also looks at one of the most significant features. One of the things that comes out, a characteristic of those who are millennials or Generation Z people, is that there's a real sense of detachment, loneliness, isolation. And then it's interesting because right away he identifies some things. People say, well, one of the big problems is technology, right? That's the big issue. Well, he points out that might not be as big of an issue as people might think. It actually might be other deeper factors. Not that he's just
so the people that are listening to this now on their phones can just be perfectly fine. Everything's wonderful. Don't worry about your phone addiction.
Yeah, well, I think I really like the fact that, and that's just one of the few points that he makes in this first piece. I think that's important. It's not, he doesn't discount the influence of technology. I mean, none of us, it would be ridiculous to do that. The point he makes is that based on a lot of the data we have, that to say that, hey, kids that aren't on phones are doing great and thriving, and then kids who are constantly on phones or on screens or whatever, they're a complete mess, and it's and I think it's fair to say some people do look at it that way, and rather he says no, they're deeper familial relational issues at work here. In other words, the way that I interpreted part of what he was saying, and I know he's going to get into it further as he goes through the series, is that in many ways the use of screens is more of a symptom than the core problem, right? Or core problems. There's obviously many of them. And we all know a lot of the usual suspects, which are very, very true. Family breakup, divorce, the fact that a lot of families move a great deal, the kids get shuffled between homes if there's, divorce involved, I mean, et cetera, et cetera. So we know a lot of those. But what I like about this series, I think, is that it tries to go much deeper. And then the goal of it is really to see how can the church, how can we as Catholics better engage with those who are ages 10 to 25? How can we better evangelize, catechize, interact, relate? I think it's easy to get.
So give us the title of the article.
Well, that means I have to go over to that page and look at it.
Sorry about that.
I'm generation. What am I? Generation? I don't know. Like Generation X. This is kind of difficult. So it's titled "Walking with Generation Z: Understanding the Loneliest Generation." So in this very first piece, Ben Erickson begins by focusing on that. That's one thing that really jumps out in these various studies, is that sense of isolation that so many young people have. Obviously, the last 3 years did not help at all. In fact, right. I mean, we know many of the sad stories and situations that have, people that are already struggling, young people that are already struggling, were then forced into even more difficult situations where they were further isolated. Everything was on the screen, distancing, etc. So I think it's going to be a very worthwhile, in-depth series that we're doing at Catholic World Report.
I agree. I read the article. I found it very insightful. I'm not sure at the end of the day that church leaders have fully grasped, what the impact of this for youth ministry and Catholic schools and evangelizing youth and all of that. So it's important, I think, that people in leadership positions of the church read the article and think carefully about it. So I know this is a big issue and there's a lot of conversation about it. So we need to stay on task, as it were, in this area. I want to ask you about another article. It goes a little bit back to what we were talking about before. We talked about this a little before the program here. And this is the Christian Bruegger article. Without descending into the details of, finer points of magisterial authority and high-end theology, this is an article entitled "Pope Francis, Contraception and the Problem of Ecclesial Authority." Now, I'm going to, for a second, bracket out the whole Pope Francis question, partly because I think, Pope Francis obviously continues to teach the church's teaching on contraception, contrary to what you might suppose from what some people say. Now, so just going to bracket that out for a moment. there was discussion about whether or not the teaching on contraception has been infallibly proposed. And whenever you introduce the I word, you get all these kinds of controversies about it. And Christian Bruegger is a theologian, does a good job of explaining the different levels of teaching in the church. And when we say different levels of teaching, we talk about the idea that God has revealed himself, told us about himself, and told us about ourselves in relation to him. So how we should think about God, how we should think about ourselves, how we should act in relation to God, how we should act in relation to ourselves and to one another. So we have faith and morals, broadly construed. And the church teaches what God has revealed and faith and morals, but teaches at different levels. You need to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I was recently looking back at some notes from a course I took in the Master's in Theological Studies program that you taught in back when you were a very young man.
Well, yes, when I was 12, right?
You were 12 or 13 years old, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
And I was very fortunate to have taken moral theology from the great late Dr. Mark Lowry, who was, a phenomenal man and professor. And he makes an interesting point in his notes. This, I think, touches a little bit on this. He says that one of the arguments, and he's going back to the issue of Humanae Vitae and through the 70s and 80s, that you had certain theologians who say, well, hey, if this has not been infallibly defined, then it's still an open question. And one of the points that Dr. Lowry makes really strongly is they overlook the fact that there are things that the church has infallibly, or has consistently taught. That's part of the ordinary magisterium. This is part of Dr. Bruegger's article, that it's just consistently there as part of the ordinary magisterium. Now, of course, there's a lot of debate and talk about what makes up the ordinary magisterium. But I think, in my experience, more than a few Catholics don't really understand. They really do think that, hey, if it's not emphatically there in the Bible, or if it's not been infallibly proclaimed by a council or a pope, then everything's up for grabs, or these things are open for grabs. And what Bruegger and Lowry state is, there are things that have been consistently taught, and of course they're rooted in scripture and tradition, natural law, etc., that just are consistently taught, are part of what we call the ordinary magisterium. And to say that, hey, if it's not been defined, then it's still an open question, is really disingenuous. It's really a form of, it is, it's kind of a form of fundamentalism, right?
Yeah.
It's like, if I don't see it right there in this particular text, then it's an open question. It's like, well, no, that doesn't necessarily hold. There are a lot of things that the church has consistently taught, even if it's not infallibly defined them, that we say, yes, that's absolutely the case. And this is really true of a lot of, as you know, of many moral issues, right? It's not like the church has this long list of, we infallibly define that these various moral acts are wrong. We don't see that. What you have is just the consistent teaching. You obviously have the Ten Commandments, you have moral teachings of Scripture, etc., but it's all part of a cohesive whole. And a lot of this comes through in what the church, or what we call the ordinary magisterium. So I think that's one of the points that Dr. Bruegger really comes back to as he analyzes some things that are going on.
Right. There was a book that I think it was the Pontifical Council for Life, or the names of all these things are changing, so I can't always remember which one's changed and what hasn't. But there was a book in which one of the contributors, it came out of this Congress, the Pontifical Academy of Life, for Life, published a book. There was an essay in it. And in that essay, one of the essay that was written by one of the contributors of the Congress raised the question about churches teaching on contraception, and could it be reevaluated in such a way that there could be the possibility of a couple using contraception. This is an old debate. It's going on going back to even before the Second Vatican Council. But the church has consistently taught, no, this is not, and part of Christian Bruegger's argument is that it isn't just that it has not been infallibly defined. You and I followed this, I think, on Twitter, where there's this argument going on back and forth. Well, Humanae Vitae, the papal encyclical in 1968, Pope Paul VI issued in response to the controversy about birth control. The church has always opposed contraception. The contraceptive pill, invented in the late 1950s, raised the question, well, does this apply to the contraceptive pill? There was some study and debate about this, but at the end of the day, the Pope looked at it and said the church's teaching on contraception applies to the pill as well, and therefore, it can't morally be used. It's contrary to the purpose of sexual intercourse and the spousal meaning of sexual intercourse and so on. Okay, so there's this controversy online about the fact that the Vatican spokesman, when the encyclical was released back in 1968, was asked a question about it, and he said that the encyclical itself did not amount to an infallible definition. And as you know, Carl, there's the discussion that followed from that was not whether or not the encyclical itself was a papal definition of morals, but whether the teaching that was in that document has been proposed, or when we say proposed, we mean taught as true. It's not like, well, here's a proposal. I mean, taught as true, the teaching in that encyclical against contraception, has it been taught as true definitively by the ordinary magisterium? So a definition of dogma by the Pope, or definition of matter of faith pertaining to faith and morals by the Pope or a church ecumenical council, is what we call the extraordinary magisterium. But the teaching of bishops dispersed throughout the world, when they teach the teaching of Christ in their ordinary ministry, we call that the ordinary magisterium. So what Christian Bruegger is trying to stress is that just because something has not been infallibly defined in the extraordinary magisterium doesn't mean it hasn't been taught infallibly or irreformably. It's not going to change by the ordinary magisterium. And so there are various conditions for that. But what is amazing to me, and I kind of going on and on about this, what's amazing to me is there is all kinds of discussion about this topic for the last 40, 50 years. And I've referred to John C. Ford, Germaine Griset's article, Contraception, the Ordinary Magisterium of the Church, which Ignatius Press, by the way, published in a book back in, I think, the late 1980s called The Teaching of Humanae Vitae. And there are any number of theologians today who would hold that teaching is infallibly taught from the ordinary magisterium. But it's amazing to me today that this is now being experienced by so many people as a novel idea, or they'd never heard of this before. People are supposedly following things in the church.
I made the joke recently that I'm 53 years old, and I'm just I sarcastically noted how grateful I am that now I get to live through the 1970s.
Yes.
And for example, you mentioned Ignatius Press and all this. So here's a book.
Yes.
Great historian, Dr. James Hitchcock, who taught for many years at St. Louis University. This book was published by Ignatius Press in 1983 or 1984, called Years of Crisis, 1985. And it's collected essays from 1970 to 1983. And it's interesting reading that because, of course, he talks at length about these different issues, these very same controversies over moral theology, Humanae Vitae, contraception. He has stuff in there about abortion. And as I've been going through and reading sections of it, I'm thinking, hey, Ignatius Press should just republish this. But instead of saying collected essays 1970, 1983, put collected essays, 2000, whatever, to 2022. And it really is remarkable. Now, of course, there are differences. And now, of course, we have the context of where things have really advanced, because all these things are connected, of course, where we have the transgender issue and we have the, et cetera, et cetera. So, but it is remarkable. And I think that's something, though, it's an important point for people to keep in mind, that these debates have been going on and in a real sense have been settled. It's not that we can't discuss them or whatever, but and of course now, I talked about people who want change. Well, they use the term development, and they say, well, this is about teaching developing. It's like, well, as John Paul II made very clear in Veritatis Splendor, there are certain moral acts that are objectively sinful and evil, no matter the culpability of those committing them.
Right.
They are objectively wrong every time. Contraception is one of those. Abortion is one of those. Adultery, how,
Right.
et
And
cetera,
and
et cetera.
and as you're right, as you say, mindful of culpability, but that just means how blameworthy
Yeah,
am I for
yeah,
having done something that's wrong? That's what that means. It doesn't mean that what is wrong suddenly isn't wrong simply because I'm not blameworthy for it. And so that's really the issue. Is it wrong in itself? Not, you know, obviously it's for confession. We can ask the question. The priest's going to say, how culpable is a person for doing this? But whether it's presented as wrong or not is not, it's not relevant to ask whether the
yeah.
person who did this thing is culpable.
I know we have to wrap up here in a bit, Mark, but I wanted to quickly point out, and I was reminded this by Kate Harmon, who's handling our video, that millennials are not exactly the same thing as Gen Z. And I appreciate that correction. That's a good point. Millennials, I think, more generally are those who've reached adulthood in the early 21st century, right? So you could be older than 25 and be considered a millennial, if I understand that correctly. I'm not, I'm a Gen Xer. I think I am, and I don't even know what that means.
I'm a baby boomer. I'm a tail end baby boomer. So we've
no,
got
I do.
different.
I obviously I'm joking a little bit. I do, understand. So, and I think those breakdowns are, they can be helpful. Obviously, you can look at generations, and you can see patterns and so forth, and that's important to study that. Just like this series that CWR is going to. But I think too, we have to look at the flow also. I mean, we are such products in many ways of those generations that have gone before us and of the cultural kind of streams that have come down. So making sense of a lot of these things, it's obviously, very, very involved.
Well, increasingly aging guys here. Of course, when we stop aging, we're dead. Talking about this is interesting, and you're 10 years younger than I am, but the generation disconnect. And you're talking about Gen Z and then Gen X and millennials and baby boomers and all of that. The generational disconnect is interesting and important to talk about. Obviously, with respect to what Ben Erickson is calling the loneliest generation so far, that's important. Issues around that and reaching that generation, helping those young people come to know the purpose of life, which is to know Jesus Christ and enter into the fullness of life through that saving union with him. Okay, that's what we want to do. We want to help them. But even within the church and people who are Catholics or Christians and they know Christ, this phenomenon of needing to rediscover the past is a fascinating thing. I'm becoming more and more mindful of it as I get older and I see younger people come on the scene. It seemed to me that for a while there was excitement about young people on their own discovering or rediscovering things, and that was great. But we seem to have entered into a period now, and I don't know if it's something to do with the Francis pontificate or I don't know what it is, but we seem to have entered a period now where what's being discovered are the mistakes of the 1960s and 1970s, and they're being treated as if nothing that preceded, or certainly nothing that followed that addressed those mistakes has happened. And that's
Right.
a real challenge. That's going to be a real challenge for us because we're going to be tending to dismiss and say we've been there, done that already. And that's not an adequate answer. I acknowledge that in dealing
Right.
with these younger people. But we nevertheless are going to have to help them see that they're not the first people to discover these things. And there have been many people who have already responded and worked through these issues.
Yeah.
So
Well, and
Anyway, I
I would
leave
just
you
say,
with that.
well, I just quickly, as we conclude, I would just say on top of that, one of the reasons I became Catholic 25 years ago was that I began to discover that, one, I wasn't nearly as smart as I thought I was. In fact, I was pretty abjectly ignorant, not stupid, but ignorant, very ignorant. And as I began to read across the tradition, Saint Augustine, Aquinas, Newman, Chesterton, I began to see, hey, wait a second, these guys and women have addressed these issues, and they have come up with far deeper, more profound insights than I have. And I really do think there's an issue of humility involved here. Are we going to approach history and reality with humility and recognize, yeah, all those people had flaws, of course. We have flaws too, though. And I think there's a real chronological snobbery, but also more to what you're saying. Things are kind of being taken out of context, and there's no sense of this flow, the relationship of different ideas and movements and people and so forth together. And I think things are so fragmented, and whether that's a technological issue, I know obviously part of it has to do with technology and social media, absolutely. But I think too, it's just the people, there's a real struggle there. So I think that catechetically, we have a lot of work to do. We always do. It's always been that way. But I think that's one of the challenges. I think you've put your finger on a big challenge that we're going to be facing right now and for years to come.
Carl Olson, editor of Catholic World Report, thanks for the conversation and keep up the good work.
Thanks, Mark.